This is exciting. I've never done this.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. Well, today's lecture is actually the last of this first issue of our Bulletin of Near Eastern Excavations and Research. If you have missed the previous lectures, or if you desire to rewatch them, you can find them here on YouTube on our channel. As you may know, if you attended the past lectures, I am Valentina Santini, and I will moderate this last meeting of this bulletin, which is focused on current archaeological excavations and ongoing projects in the Near East. Due to the fact that this bulletin is intended both for the scientific and the general public, at the end of the lecture, there would be a section dedicated to questions and comments. In fact, we are live, and if you desire to learn more about the topic of this lecture, you just have to write your considerations in the YouTube chat, which is here next to our video. And at the end of the lecture, I'm going to read those questions or those comments to our speaker. So the title of today's lecture is Landscape and Empire in Ancient Assyria, the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey. So please let me introduce our speaker, J.Ur from Harvard University. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction, Valentina, and thank you to the Center for Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Studies for inviting me to speak to them and to you as part of this excellent series. All right. So, as Valentina mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you today about landscape and empire in ancient Assyria. Recent fieldwork results from a project that I co-direct, the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey. This is a collaborative project between international archaeologists, including me from Harvard University, and the Erbil Directorate of Antiquities in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So let me get my slides set up here. Okay. So this is a project that is designed to understand how past landscapes achieve their structure and their meaning. And to contextualize this a little bit, I want to start by saying something about how landscapes formed. I find it very useful to understand landscapes as situated on a continuum between planned at one end and emergent on the other. I use these two examples to demonstrate this. On the right, you see the city of Hamadan in Iran, and you'll notice that it is highly planned. It has a radiating set of boulevards radiating out from the center that were very clearly designed by planners and then imposed upon a pre-existing town. Now, this is monumental in scale. It clearly relied on a centralized planning authority to plan and to create. But on the flip side, on the other end of this continuum, are settlements like the marsh Arab village that I'm showing you here on the left. It's also highly structured. The reed houses are all roughly the same size. They're all roughly the same orientation. They are situated on reed islands that are all roughly the same size and all spaced very, very evenly from each other for the most part. So this is no less structured than what you see on the right, but the difference is the structure in the village emerged. It's a bottom-up or self-organized process whereby individual builders of households, understand these rules about how far they should be, how their houses should be organized. And so this structure emerges from their individual actions rather than from some master planner. Now, most landscapes, modern and ancient, we find them somewhere in the middle of this continuum, a combination of top-down planning and bottom-up emergence. Now, my previous research is focused on the early Bronze Age in the Middle East, and in particular, I was interested in the the paths of movement associated with the cities of the early Bronze Age, about 4,500 years ago. Here you're seeing an example at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria. The mound of the site is at the center in this satellite photograph, but I want you to notice the radiating dark lines around it. These are what we call hollowways or trackways. It's tempting to see these road networks as the product of the kings of these early Bronze Age kingdoms. But in my analysis, mapping these features over many hundreds of square kilometers, I don't see any top-down planning. In fact, I can best understand these road networks as a bottom-up emergence as farmers and herders go from their villages, towns, and cities out to their fields and their pasture. So in other words, this is monumental, and it's planned by individual movements of farmers and herders, but it wasn't centralized. It wasn't the kings of Nagar and other kingdoms that did this. But this did raise the question of what does a planned landscape look like? And that's what brought me to the Assyrians. Unlike the early Bronze Age, anecdotal evidence produced by me and other scholars suggests that the landscape of Assyria might have been closely planned by kings and their courts over the course of a couple of centuries in the Neo-Assyrian period. Why I think that, I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to say something really quickly to you about the Assyrian Empire. In the early first millennium BC, this was the largest territorial state in the world. I would argue the first unambiguous empire, and it covered almost all of Syria and Iraq and major parts of today's Iran, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Israel, in some cases even extending into Egypt. The core of the empire was along the Tigris River in what is today the northern part of Iraq, and including a lot of the autonomous Kurdistan region of Iraq. So here's that core. The capital cities along the Tigris River moved progressively to the north over the course of the Assyrian state, from Ashur in the south, ultimately ending up at Nineveh, which is today in and around the city of Mosul. However, a very important provincial city was the city of Erbil in the direction of the Zagros Piedmont to the east. And these capital cities plus Erbil are often referred to as the Assyrian Triangle. And this is really the core, the ancestral core of the Assyrian state and later the Assyrian Empire. Now, earlier work that I and others did on the landscape behind Nineveh have really suggested that this was an imposed landscape in the sense that I described earlier. A couple of reasons why we think that. Well, for one, there are these massive planned capital cities, not just the citadels, but in this case, you may see this very large, very straight set of walls that surround the imperial capital at Nineveh, enclosing some 700 hectares, the largest city that the world had seen to that point. So planned capital cities, but also very strong evidence for hydraulic engineering in the form of dams, canals, even aqueducts. You're seeing here a picture of a 400,000 square block aqueduct that was part of an irrigation system that arose at the place called Khinis, and flowed almost 100 kilometers down to the city of Nineveh. Also, there's evidence for demographic engineering. Now, this doesn't come from the core. This evidence really comes from the periphery, right around the core, but in areas that have been surveyed, we find what appears to be a process of rural colonization. The early Bronze Age cities have long since been abandoned, and the countryside is full of small and very regularly spaced villages. We assume agricultural villages. But this is not a natural pattern, this sort of very even coverage of the landscape. This suggests to me and others that villages were deliberately placed out here to maximize production. Otherwise, people wouldn't occupy marginal spaces like this. They would adhere much more closely to water. So some engineering of people in the rural countryside as well. And finally, there is good evidence that these landscapes were very ideologically charged. And this evidence comes in the form of carved reliefs, some of them very monumental, such as the panel that you see here on the left at Erbil. This shows the Assyrian king Sennacherib standing in the presence of Ashur and Melissu, the chief gods of Assyria. And Ashur and Melissu, they're handing Sennacherib the symbols of kingship. So anybody that saw this panel would understand that Sennacherib is a divinely appointed ruler of Assyria. And on the right here, you see one of the most exciting recent discoveries. This is a panel from a canal near the town of Faida. This was recovered over the course of the last years by a team led by Daniela Morandi Bonacosi at the University of Udine. And it shows a procession of gods standing on the backs of animals approaching an Assyrian king. And again, this is very ideologically charged. It shows the divine rightness of this king's this rule. You can think of these almost as propagandistic billboards of sorts. These are advertisements that drive home to the people in the countryside the divine correctness of the king's rule. So taken together, these really suggest a high degree of planning, but this is a bit anecdotal. It's based on observations made by archaeologists over some 150 years, but not really through systematic landscape research. And that's what inspired me to start the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey. But before getting into our survey, I want to go back to this issue of demographic engineering. This is particularly important because movement of people is something that is difficult to demonstrate through excavation, but it's a question that we can ask through archaeological survey, because people that move would have to go somewhere. Now, the Assyrian kings do not hesitate to tell us how successful they were at conquering peoples and then deporting them. An example from Sennacherib's third campaign claims to have moved over 200,000 people, including their animals and their property, moving them away and taking them back to Assyria. Now, obviously, this is not a historical source. This is a propagandistic document. It should not be taken as some kind of factual historical account. So we should always be skeptical of such things. On the other hand, we have other accounts here, including the account of not the victors, but the victims. And this comes from the historical books of the Bible, where very similar descriptions of what happened are made. Now, the Bible isn't a very accurate historical source as well. In fact, it is just as propagandistic as the Assyrian royal inscriptions. But when we have these two different sources from two very different views, largely telling the same story, well, then it's time to pay a little bit more close attention and to really investigate these claims to see if they are accurate and if the landscape of Assyria does have this very closely planned demographic modeling behind it. So this is what's driving our research primarily. The project, it identifies and maps all sedentary sites from the earliest period to the present. However, we really are focused specifically on this research question in this, our first phase. So let me say a little bit about methods here. Now, obviously, archaeological field methods, they need to be closely attuned to the questions that you're asking. Methods and research questions have to be very closely connected, or your results won't be very good. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Well, obviously, this is a question that must be investigated in the imperial core. This falls today in, as I've mentioned, in the Republic of Iraq, but in a large part, it falls within the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is an autonomous part of the country, which has a great deal of political stability and is also very welcoming to collaboration with foreign researchers. So we've been very lucky to have this arrangement. And so if the Kurdistan region and its capital at Erbil fall within this, the Assyrian Triangle, and the region that our collaborative project has proposed to study occupies a large part of that. And in fact, you'll notice that quite a bit of the survey area, shown here in yellow, is actually closer to Nimrud than it is to Erbil. So this survey really truly is right in the heart of the imperial core. Now, our region is not completely unknown, was known quite a bit before we arrived. Certainly the old capitals of Mosul, Nineveh, Nimrud, and some of the towns on the Nineveh plain have been known. But also there have been excavations starting earlier in the 20th century at places like Kalinj Aga, Kasr Shamamak, and since 2012, increasingly a lot of excavations on the Erbil Plain, ones that you see here. So our contract with the Kurdistan Regional Government and the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage includes 3,200 square kilometers with Erbil at its center. Now, this is an absurdly large, you might even say an obscenely large survey area. We are extremely grateful and very fortunate that the antiquities authorities have seen fit to allow us to do this. But it's a huge responsibility to cover this much area. So we've taken this very seriously, and we have an extensive program of satellite remote sensing for identifying potential archaeological sites. We've identified potentially about 2,000 different places, and we have visited more than half of those to date. I'll talk a little bit about results in a second, but I do want to tell you, how did we find these places initially? Well, in order to speed the coverage of such a vast area, we have turned to remote sensing, especially the use of historical aerial and satellite intelligence imagery, which is a kind way of saying spy plane photos and spy satellite photographs. We have been exploiting photographs from the U2 program, which in the Middle East ran from 1958 until 1960. But especially using photographs from the Corona program, 1960 to 1972, and most recently the recent declassification of the successor to Corona, which was called Hexagon, and that ran up until 1974. These were film projects, so in all cases we're not dealing with digital images, we're dealing with film. Some of you might actually remember film that has to be scanned and then georeferenced before we can use it. But it's extremely powerful, very, 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 very sensitive to the kind of signatures that archaeological sites leave on the ground. So here's a comparison. On the left, you can see a Corona image of the important Assyrian city of Kasr Shamamak. In the middle, a U2 aerial photograph from about 7 years earlier. And at right, the base image that you would see. This is very similar to what you'd see if you went to Google Maps, or in this case, this is the base imagery from the Esri software application. The Corona imagery is remarkably sensitive to the discoloration of soils that comes with human occupation. So we can use Corona to find what we would call anthrosols. The U2 imagery is less sensitive to anthrosols, but it was taken always at a very early hour. And therefore it's very sensitive to the raking light that comes from sunrise. And therefore it can be used really well to see standing structures like buildings and very subtle mounding, which characterizes archaeological sites. So that's what makes it useful for us. The modern imagery is very pretty because it's in color. But for the most part, we find that the last 50 to 60 years of development have really degraded the landscape such that, for the most part, modern imagery really only helps us to identify recent damage, and also it shows the roads that we need to know about in order to get to these places. So we use it for navigation more than we use it for site identification. Now, all of our data goes into a GIS database, which in the past existed on my personal computer and on my personal, very expensive GPS. But in the last 4 years, we've taken all of this data off of local machines where only I can see it. We put it into the cloud. So it's accessible by desktop computers using a browser. You're seeing ArcGIS Online here. And this includes all of our spatial data, our sites, our observations, in some cases, even our imagery exists in the cloud where it can be shared with all of our team members. But of course, it's not limited to their desktops, their laptops and PCs. We can push this out onto mobile devices such as iPads, tablets, and especially smartphones. So we now do all of our data collection in the field off of mobile devices like iPhones. This has been revolutionary for our team because instead of just me being the project director with all of the data in my hand and everybody else needs to hear it from me, now every team member has all of our data in their own pocket on their own smartphones. This has been wonderful. So the data is no longer held purely by the one foreigner. So these data are what we use to navigate to the places in the field. We visit them, we divide up their surfaces into areas, we collect them, and we also map them. In the past, this was a time-consuming process that involved a lot of walking around with a GPS. But in the past 3 years, we've taken this and put it almost entirely into the hands of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones. Our project has 3. 2 of them are what we would call quadcopters, such as what you see here. And these are multi-rotor drones with a camera on the bottom that can fly for maybe 15 minutes or so before they have to be landed and recharged. But 3 years ago, we bought a fixed wing device. This is a propeller-driven fixed wing device that flies a bit like an airplane that has a very high precision GPS on board that can be resolved down to about 7 or 8 centimeters in 3-dimensional space, and a very high precision camera as well. This drone can stay up for about almost an hour and allows us to map really large sites. The way this operates, the drone passes back and forth across the archaeological site in transects, which overlap very strongly. The overlap between the images allows remote sensing software to create a 3-dimensional model from those photos. So we go from photos, many photos, in some cases over 1,000 per site, and we turn that into data. So what you're looking at here is the coarse topographic data of an archaeological site that we used to use primarily prior to the drone. And on the right is the kind of data that we can get from these transects and data processing. It is so spectacularly accurate that we can see the furrows of the agricultural fields. We can see very subtle evidence for some excavation, and you can even see our 2 survey vehicles right here. I would prefer that those not be in the image, but our driver and translator, Bapio Rowanduzi, he loves to get as close to the site as he can, and I'm not going to tell him no. Let me show you how this plays out on a particularly complicated site, our site 654. This site, you can see, is a lot of small white spots on corona imagery. Each one of these spots is likely to have been a house compound. This is in 1967. In recent imagery, the site is much more difficult to see, and in fact, it's been damaged along the top by a modern state irrigation system. We visited this site in 2019 and took about 400 photographs of it using the fixed wing EB. These individual images were turned into one very large ortho photo, which also isn't very helpful. The site has been badly damaged by modern agriculture, including these irrigated cornfields that you see here. But the terrain data is much more helpful. In the terrain data, you can see the very subtle elevations that probably represent those individual compounds in this very large, very diffuse multi-mounded site. Now, once we have these data, this topographic data, we can subdivide the site in advance and push these subdivisions out onto the individual smartphones and mobile devices of all of our team members, such that when they finally visit the site, they know precisely where to go to collect these individual sub areas very precisely without any overlap, and we can therefore identify which parts of these sites were occupied at which periods. And the ultimate goal is to produce something like this. This is a site, you might call this a settlement biography of this particular archaeological site. And we want to do this not just for individual sites, but for every site in the region, so that we can describe the history of settlement through time. So these are the methods that we use. And now I'd like to turn to what these methods have told us since we began this project in 2012. You'll notice that I'm talking about results between 2012 and 2020. Not very many projects had a summer 2020 field season, but we actually did. Now, I wasn't there. Rocco and Petra, the associate directors, were not there, but we have 5 very well-trained Kurdish team members that are based in Erbil, and they had a season without any foreigners this year. It was small scale, but it was very successful, I'm proud to say, and we'll talk a little bit about that when I conclude. So we visited some 11,000, we have visited some 1,135 potential archaeological sites that we identified from imagery. And of those, we've confirmed 721 to date. It's a very large data set of archaeological sites. We still have about 820 that we need to visit. And as we get new data sets, we're constantly finding new potential archaeological sites. So I imagine that ultimately we're going to have probably somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 places that we need to visit by the end of this, just in this area. Now, in our 7 field seasons, we have covered roughly half of this area, a little less than half. And that's in, if that's in 6 seasons over 8 years, you can see that we still have quite a bit to do. This graph shows you very quickly the history of settlement that this work has recovered. I'll explain it really briefly. The bars represent the number of archaeological sites through time, with period 1 here on the left being Hassuna, leading up to period 20 being the Ottoman period. So very generally, the bars show that in prehistory, there were small numbers of sites, and they were pretty small in themselves. The line represents the total area of hectares and should be read on this right axis. But with the start of the Bronze Age, you could see that there's this really steep increase, culminating in period 11, so Middle Bronze Age. I'll talk a bit about the Middle Bronze Age before getting to the Neo-Assyrian period, but you can see that there's this great culmination in period 11, which is the Iron Age or the Neo-Assyrian period, and that's what I'll mostly be talking about. And then in the later phases, settlement kind of fluctuates, but we're still kind of working out the details on that. This is work that's being led by my colleagues, Rocco Palermo, looking at the Seleucid, Hellenistic, Parthian phases, and Karol Novacek, who's looking at the Sasanian and Islamic phases in particular. Before getting to the Assyrians, I want to say something about the Middle Bronze Age, because it's a really stark and interesting contrast. This was a time when most of northern Mesopotamia had been conquered by the king Shamshi Adad, based out of Mari and Shubat Enlil in northeastern Syria. We do know that in the Erbil region, there was supposed to have been a previously independent kingdom based at a city called Cabra, which had not been identified. But it's something that we were looking for when we first started this project in 2012, because we knew that this lost city should be somewhere in the Erbil Plain area. And ultimately, I settled on this place right here as a candidate, purely based on remote sensing. It has, at center, you can see a small mounded tell here with a cemetery. That dark spot is a cemetery, and a big area of discoloration around it on all sides, covering some 20 hectares, which looks really impressive. 20 hectares is relatively large, but actually that's only a part of it. If you look closely, you'll notice that there is a light line that stretches around it in a kind of an oval shape. looping around and kind of going under this modern village down here. This is about 100 hectares enclosed within what it seemed to me to be a city wall. Now we know that Cabra was walled, and this seemed like a good candidate. So we visited it in our first season in 2012, and we've revisited it several times since then, especially looking to see if we could find evidence for this city wall. And I'd like for you to notice this curving line in the bottom image. You can see it particularly clear on the right, and I'll draw a line around it just to help you. Very, very subtle, previously unnoticed on the ground, but really clear in terrain data. So this is a product of about 1,200 drone photographs stitched together into a digital elevation model. Now, starting shortly after we visited the site, it became the subject of excavations by Johns Hopkins University, led by Glenn Schwartz. You can see some of their excavations right here. And this also included a geophysical component. The Hopkins project has covered even more at this point, but I would like you to notice this line right up here at the top. I'll zoom in on this right here. This is the geophysical remains of the Cobra City wall. If you look closely, you'll see that there are small bastions at roughly 20-meter intervals all along this northern edge of the site. And excavations here have confirmed this Middle Bronze Age dating, both of the majority of the site and of the wall itself, which fits really nicely with what we know from historical sources that Cabra was a walled city that was conquered and the wall was destroyed. This is pretty cool. I have to say that it was very exciting to find a lost city. And I should say that we don't have any epigraphic proof at this point, but I am 99% certain that this is what's there. This is kind of cool. It's kind of exciting. It's not particularly scientifically relevant, but it's fun to get excited about stuff. What is scientifically relevant is the settlement pattern of the Middle Bronze Age, especially as it compares to what comes with the Assyrians. Kurd Kabristan, site number 31, which is likely to be ancient Cabra, is a large urban space of maybe 10 to 15,000 people. Lots of other small towns, villages surrounding it, all relatively evenly spaced and all very close to water. This is important. Surface water seems to have been the primary factor for the decisions about where to settle in this Middle Bronze Age. And as we're going to see, very different from the decision-making process that we've discovered with Assyria. So let's turn now to what we found of the Assyrian core. As a spoiler, I'll say our hypotheses have largely been sustained, not perfectly, but really with some spectacular detail that we'll describe, including things like dams and monumental canals. But let me start with this demographic engineering question. You'll remember that the movement of people, questioning the movement of people, was largely why we undertook this project in the beginning. And we find that in the Assyrian period, in the Neo-Assyrian period, there was an explosion of archaeological sites, and they are overwhelmingly disconnected from water sources. It's a little hard to show you here, but the average distance to surface water in the Assyrian period is by far the largest of any other period. People were choosing to settle or being forced to settle in marginal areas. I say marginal because they're far away from natural surface water. Whether they were far away from artificial surface water, well, I'll get to that in a moment. Urban planning definitely present. This is the very large 50-hectare city of Qasr Shamamak, which I've mentioned previously, showing very clearly the citadel and the walled lower town around it. We would expect to find this. This is a known archaeological site, and it's been the subject of excavations by a French team since 2011, right? The first foreign team to come to Kurdistan. But urban centers like this, these are what we think of when we think of Assyria, but they are exceptional compared to sites like these. Very small, very low, on the order of maybe 2 or 3 hectares, these are overwhelmingly what the Assyrian landscape looks like: small rural sites. And this is what we would have expected based on what we saw from places like Hamilcar, survey areas around Hamilcar, around the North Jazeera, in adjacent areas to the core. Let me show you this in numbers. So here are 4 survey areas comparing the size and density of archaeological sites of the Assyrian period. In the North Jazeera survey, the Badar survey, and the Hamilcar survey, sites were very abundant in the Neo-Assyrian period, on the order of, say, 0.1 to almost 0.2 sites per square kilometer. But in the Erbil Plain, they're even more dense. Just a little bit, but slightly more dense. And the average size in these other areas were on the order of maybe 1.5 to 3 hectares. And if you exclude Erbil itself and Qasr Shamamak, the city, you'll see that that average site size was very similar. So the core of Assyria is, again, a largely rural place with small sites, not as evenly distributed as what we saw in the North Jazeera. That's the one place where our expectations were not met. But I'd like to say something about the engineering of the hydrology as well. There is abundant evidence of monumental canals that must have required state level or even imperial level labor control to excavate. The best example is the canal that you see here near the village of Zaga, right here. You'll see that there's a natural watercourse at the bottom and another natural drainage here up at the top. But I want you to follow the cursor as it moves from this natural watercourse into this artificial channel, which cuts through the watershed between them, culminates in a very large basin. This is about 300 meters wide, which has a spillway that then empties out into that other natural drainage. This is an absolutely massive feature. Must have required many thousands of person hours to excavate. Here you're seeing it in a hexagon spy photo image. This basin here is especially impressive. But really the best way to see this, I should say, we covered this with about 4,000 drone photographs and processed it into a digital elevation model that really shows the width and depth of this. It's on the order of 100 meters wide, and in places it's up to 10 meters deep. To truly get the scale of it, it helps to fly over it like this. You're looking along the course of it, and for scale, I'd like you to look to the left. You'll see a vehicle and you'll see a person standing there. That's Khalil Barzinji. He's our drone pilot. This makes the monumental scale of this feature even more clear. We can't absolutely date it yet, but morphologically and based on the sites that are closest to it, it's very likely to be a product of Neo-Assyrian imperial planning. And now I would like to turn to the north of our survey area, along one of the tributaries that frames our survey area. This is the Bastora River, where for almost a century, we've known about a subterranean channel that started in this river valley and led underground for about 25 kilometers to Erbil itself, which, as I mentioned at the time, was a very important Assyrian city. You can see the cut stone blocks that form the canal head here. And until 1991, there was a cuneiform inscription over this that named Sennacherib as the king that commissioned it and described how it flowed underground. That inscription was stolen in the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War, unfortunately. So this has been known about for a long time. And when we visited the site and created this terrain, we really wanted terrain data of this. We wanted to be able to see it in its context. But we learned something new from the ortho photo that resulted from this. Please notice a couple 100 meters away from the canal head right here, you'll notice this area of stones that had been uncovered by mining activities. This is an area of gravel mining for cement production, which has really put this feature at risk. But if you zoom in on it, This is the foundations of a very large feature that we suppose is some sort of a diversionary feature, perhaps a dam or a weir of some kind, but massive in scale. This is 20 meters wide. It's been badly damaged along its upstream face, but on its downstream face, you'll notice that there's a strong linearity of stones that if you follow that linearity, it goes straight to the Canal Head. So you have to imagine that there was a diversionary feature of monumental proportions stretching across this river valley and pushing water in the direction of this Canal Head, which would then feed the water at probably very high pressure in the direction of Erbil, where it could be utilized. Now, excavation work undertaken by my colleague, Nader Babakar, the director of antiquities for the Erbil Governorate, has proven that underneath these silts, where the dashed line is, that in fact that feature continues. And it may have been as long as 500 meters. So 20 meters wide, 500 meters long. This was a massive feature. So generally, we feel like our hypotheses about a planned nature, they have been confirmed. We still need to do some more in-depth spatial analyses of our results, where we consider ourselves still to be in the early phases of this project, despite having done it for some 7 full seasons at this point. But I'd also like to say something about its durability. So planned landscapes that are imposed by a few planners, they may not have full buy-in from all of the people that have to live within them. And that certainly seems to be the case with this planned landscape of the core of Assyria. On the left is the pattern at the height of the empire, in the early 1st millennium BC. And when we next can draw an accurate picture of settlement, this is in the Hellenistic or Seleucid period, you can see that the number of sites and their size have dwindled really dramatically. This is a phase of settlement that's being studied by my colleague, Rocco Palermo. So what's happened here? Well, it seems to me quite likely that the populations that were imposed on this through demographic engineering and then sustained by these irrigation systems may not have bought into the idea of the landscape of Assyria. In fact, it's entirely possible that with the dissolution of political power, the people that had been deported and put into this landscape, they or their descendants may have decided not to stay, go back to where they were. So here's a case where this landscape might have had a structure, but it may have not had a shared meaning to all of the inhabitants that were there. So we also see after this time a dramatic change in the nature of the hydrology. Those large canals go out of use and they're replaced by smaller systems that operate almost entirely underground. These are qanats or kares, as they're known in Kurdish and Persian. And they are unbelievably abundant across the plain. All of these white spots that you see in this corona photograph are the maintenance shafts to underground kares systems. And with my colleague, Dr. Mernoush Soroush, and also with Nader Babakar, we're investigating this kares landscape, and it's very abundant. We've mapped some 10,000 shafts across the plain, and we find that it's very closely associated with the later phases of occupation. We're still testing to see just how early it went. So we still have a lot of work to do. But our time is kind of limited here. For one thing, the plain is rapidly developing. And we see this in small scales at archaeological sites that are being taken away for the expansion of agricultural fields. This site, number 44, is Proto-Hassuna, or some very, very early version of the Neolithic that there are no ceramics, so we can't really date it very well. It is being systematically removed by a local farmer. So this is one case, but I could show you dozens of other cases where sites are being threatened. And the biggest threat of all comes from the success of the city of Erbil. It's a safe, economically successful place that is expanding rapidly, demographically and physically. You can see here the way it's grown from 1967 on the left to 2014 on the right. And every year that we come back, we find that there's new development, including this new planned ring road that will come into operation in the coming decade. So we are doing our best at this point to include a salvage component to our work. We try to get out ahead of this project. We can't stop it. And indeed, the city of Erbil needs to grow. The Erbil region and Kurdistan in general was neglected by the national government for most of the 20th century. So it really is important that the Kurdistan region go through this development process to kind of catch up. But we're hoping that this will be done smartly and in a way that respects the cultural heritage that it threatens as it goes. So we find ourselves surveying a lot of spaces that look like this, where the future ring road has already been inscribed on the ground in the form of banks and berms, so we can find out what stands to be lost in the future. So I will finish here and take questions or comments, but before I do that, I want to acknowledge the fact that this is truly a collaborative project. It's a large team with members from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, some Americans, some Europeans, professional PhDs, as well as students. And I want to single out here my co-director. Oh, he's not in this photo. My co-director is Nader Babakar of the Directorate of Antiquities in Erbil Governorate. And my co-director, or my associate directors are Rocco Palermo and Petra Creamer. I mentioned that we had a field season this year, and this was entirely carried out by our Kurdish team members. This includes Nader Babakar, you see here, as well as our long-term liaison translator and driver, Bapir Rawanduzi, Aram Mohammed Amin, Mohammed Lashkri, and Pishtuwan Ahmed. Not pictured here is our drone pilot, Khalil Barzinji. This season demonstrated to us that with true collaboration and true training, there is really no reason why the sorts of work that is done almost entirely by foreigners now cannot be undertaken by our Kurdish Iraqi collaborators. At this point, I feel like we foreigners should be just grateful that we still get invited to do this research. So I dearly miss my team. I miss these guys, and I'm really sad that I couldn't be out there, but we are immensely proud of this accomplishment. In conclusion, I want to acknowledge, well, first, of course, the Kurdistan Regional Government, especially its General Director of Antiquities, Kak Kafi, the General Director, the Director of Antiquities in Erbil Governorate, and the KRG's representation in Washington, D.C., as well as the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in Baghdad. We received funding from Harvard University and the University of Groningen, as well as the National Science Foundation, the National Geographic Society, and the Dumbarton Oaks here at Harvard University. We are extremely grateful from all these colleagues and funding sources for encouraging and supporting our work. And finally, thank you for tuning in this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to find yourself on the face of the planet. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting, really fascinating. And I really hope that it will produce some questions. However, in the meantime, while you were talking about these, we had some questions, so I'm going to read them to you. The first one is, are there traces of smaller canals or other water control devices stemming from the Zaga or any other major canal?
Well, because of preservation issues, the features that survive and are most easy to find are these very, very monumental ones. Now, obviously, we're interested to know whether there were offtakes. We're interested to know kind of specifics about how much land could have been irrigated. But these smaller features are the ones that are most easily taken away by subsequent development. And we have some traces, but we can't describe them as a proper network. You have to remember that it's been almost 3,000 years since the Assyrian Empire, about 2,500 years since it collapsed. That's 2,500 years for subsequent settlement to plow away these traces, for erosion to take place. So we really only have the backbone of these systems. We can't describe the fine dendritic nature of an irrigation system. And this is obviously disappointing, but not surprising.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question by Giorgio and Marilyn Buccellati. Brilliant, Jason, thanks. A question. Do you have evidence for perceptual geography in Near Assyrian period as for Old Akkadian, terminology that goes along with ideology as shown by the panels?
Nice to have the Buccellatis joining us. Thank you for the question. Well, I have to say, first of all, overwhelmingly our focus has been on the structure rather than the meaning. So I wouldn't claim to be the authoritative person to answer this. We have a sense for how elevation was perceived through some. We do know that there were letters written that explained that people shouldn't live on top of the tells. So there seems to be an understanding that the tops of tells were somehow reserved, perhaps for royal installations, palaces, and that people weren't supposed to live on the tops. So that seems like there's almost a vertical hierarchy of where people could live in a landscape that was already very, very ancient by the time of the Assyrians. But in terms of cosmic geography, this is a direction that we could go in the future. As a graduate of the University of Chicago, I suffered through at least 3 years of cuneiform training, almost all of which I have forgotten. So I largely have to rely on the translation works of other scholars. So, but it's a good question, and I'm sorry I can't answer it very satisfactorily.
Well, thank you. However, I'm sure that it would be good enough. Then other questions, and many people say thank you. Land of Nineveh Archaeological Project. Hi, Jason. Thank you for your beautiful talk, Daniele. Thank you for the great presentation. For what you are able to see from pottery collection, are Neo-Assyrian settlements usually constructed on older sites, or are they newly founded?
So thank you, Daniela. This is Daniela Morandi Bonacossi, who is the discoverer, or it was his canals that I showed you, his reliefs that I showed you along the Faida Canal, which are some of the most exciting Assyrian landscape work that has emerged in the last year. So thank you for your question, Daniela. Assyrian sites are rarely single period. It's very difficult to find a single period site anywhere, because as soon as any bump appears on the landscape, it seems that it served as a magnet for subsequent occupation. And the Assyrian period is no different. But getting back to the way I answered the Buccellatis question just now, it seems like it's uncommon for Assyrian occupation to be on top of the very large Bronze Age sites, which tend to be the ones that are tens of meters high. They do, however, occur on earlier prehistoric sites. Very often, if you look at the quantity of ceramics, we'll find a lot of, on a small mound, say maybe 1 hectare of prehistoric occupation, we'll find a lot of prehistoric pottery, and then maybe only a really small scattering of Assyrian ceramics. which suggests that it might have been a small occupation on an already small abandoned prehistoric site. And that seems to be a pattern that we're seeing repetitively, although I'm saying that kind of somewhat anecdotally. I can't back that up quantitatively just yet, but Danielle, thank you for the question.
Great. And then what is the function of the Zaga Canal? Was it for agriculture or for transportation?
So this is an interesting question, and transportation is actually something that I hadn't really considered until only the past few years. And I think that's likely to have been kind of an underappreciated function of the Assyrian canals. We have a very Mesopotamian focus, which when we think of canals, we think of the south of Iraq, where they were used to irrigate fields and sustain massive urbanization over millennia. The Zaga Canal is truly strange in that it ends with this very large basin feature, which almost seems like this could be a landscape of pleasure. This could be maybe perhaps a royal feature of some kind. It's difficult to understand how this would function. It was suggested to me by the Dutch hydraulic engineer Maurits Ertsen that this could be a form of flood control if the main river had a violent flood in it. Water could be pushed into this feature and held. Which is a possibility. But as I said before, we don't see offtakes from these features. And again, this comes from the fact that offtakes are the most ephemeral and small scale, and therefore the most easily to be removed. But getting back to the transportation question, I am now convinced that the canal that was excavated by the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal to go to Nimrud was primarily intended as a transportation network. It needs further study, but having modeled this system myself, going to Nimrud, it irrigated such a tiny area that it doesn't seem like it would justify all the effort, unless of course it was moving bulk cereals from elsewhere to feed the population. That's another talk though.
Thank you. Last question for the moment, at least. Are the members of the survey team the same as those studying pottery for dating sites?
Well, so the ceramic, the analysis of the ceramics is something that we're doing. As a first step, we're doing this in a preliminary manner. And it's largely done by me and Rocco Palermo, and we've also had the Cambridge archaeologist Augusta McMahon with us in past seasons, and she's done some pottery analysis as well. For the moment, this is done using my own experience from the Jazeera, the Syrian Jazeera, where I conducted surveys in the late 90s and early 2000s. But what we've come to realize is that the ceramic traditions of the Erbil Plain, in some cases, are radically different from these adjacent areas of Mesopotamia. And we really do need to bring in some specialists for a second round of analyses. So the dating that we're doing right now, because it's being done largely by me, we're considering this to be preliminary. At this point, because the landscape is so threatened by development, we've decided that it's more important that we focus our energies on getting these sites mapped and collected before they disappear, and finalizing our analyses of the ceramics in subsequent field seasons. This is a decision that is largely forced upon us by the rapid development of the plain.
Sure, can imagine the situation, of course. It seems we don't have any more questions. So actually, I've got a question, and I would like to ask you. Without the use of technology, how different would your work on the Erbil Plain be?
Very, very different. What we're attempting to do is survey an area on the scale of the great Mesopotamian surveys of the 1960s, the ones that were done by Robert McCormick Adams and his collaborators. But we're trying to do it at a level of intensity that is more typical of the work that was done in the 1990s by the archaeologist Tony Wilkinson. Now, usually when you have a big area, you have to survey it at a low intensity. And if you have a smaller area, you can be more intensive. And in fact, with CAMNA's members, Guido Guarducci and Stefano Valentini, I tried some of these intensive methods around their site of Hirbimerdan Tepe. But I covered, over the course of 4 seasons, I covered 17 square kilometers using these intensive methods. Now I have 3,200 square kilometers that I need to cover now. So this is where the technology comes in, especially remote sensing. So we use a relatively low intensity field method, but we can do that because the remote sensing, our ability to detect sites through remote sensing is so strong. Really, the corona and hexagon and U2 imagery is so good at detecting archaeological sites. From my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we can do a very, what I consider to be a very full coverage version using remote sensing first, and then visit them very quickly on the ground, which is, I think, how we're going to combine the intensity of a Wilkinson survey with the large area of an Adams survey. But it's the cloud technology and the remote sensing that makes this possible, and drones. I love drones.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's a new question. Hi, Jason, Francesca Simi. Thanks for the great talk. How are you documenting disturbances and threats to the sites?
Francesca, thank you for the question. So we have we document this. I mean, first and foremost, we document this through drone photogrammetry. It is easier for us to, rather than individually photograph, say, damage through agricultural expansion, or in very rare instances, is there looting. Looting is not a threat in this area. We're fortunate. We could do this on the ground, but what we really find is it's just easier to do it through drones. So every site, not just the big ones, not just the important ones, but every site gets flown by our drone team led by Khalil. And the resolution of the output imagery is so high, on the order of 3 or 4 centimeters, that we can see this damage from our imagery. At which point we make sure that it is put into our database, and these damage elements, it's a separate field of entry in our database, and we flag these and make sure that the Directorate of Antiquities knows about it. It then falls to them to follow up. But it's the drone imagery means that we can document even really slight damage. You know, modern commercial satellite imagery is roughly 50 to 60 centimeters. 50 centimeters. We're down to around 4 centimeters. So we can see really, really slight damage. And this is how we do it. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you very much for your answers. It seems we don't have any more questions. So I really would like to thank you once more for your really extremely fascinating lecture. And I would like to thank our public as well. Thank you for being with us. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this meeting, this was the last lecture of this first issue of the bulletin. However, we are planning a new issue which will start at the beginning of 2021. And which will be disclosed in these days on our website and on our social pages. In the meantime, between the first issue and the second one of the bulletin, there will be a new series of encounters, this time focused on Egyptology, called Vis-a-Vis, which will be live streamed once a week. And more details about that will be given in the next few days, again on our website and on our social channels. So again, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you
Valentina.
very much to our public. We really hope you enjoyed these lectures. So please stay tuned and thank you again. Bye, everyone.